Hello and welcome to a new podcast on actual spirit. Today we're going to talk the philosophy of right with Cadell last. At Philosophy Portal, we're going to do a course on the philosophy of right. It's going to start on the May 18th and it's going to go until June. Cadell is going to give lectures and workshops on all the chapters in the philosophy of right. And I'm going to lead the exegetical readings. And also at the course, there's going to be a conference where you get to present how you've made the theory your own, what has inspired you. You can present on what you take away from it. Afterwards, we'll have an anthology in which you can publish a paper, which is also about how the book and the course have inspired you. So today our talk will center around topics that will come up in the course. Also honing in on the exegetical readings. And my first question to Cadell is the following. So at Philosophy Portal, we've done courses on Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, on the science of logic. Respectively, the Phenomenology of Spirit is about experience, and the science of logic is about metaphysics. And given the fact that our world is evidently in a political turmoil, I don't have to give an example for you to know what this means. What is it that the Hegel's philosophy of right can teach us? You know, it's an old book. It was published in 1821. It was before the pervasive industrialization. It was before the two world wars, before the Cold War, and before the neoliberal era, and before the techno-capitalist hegemony, especially after, which has increased, especially after COVID, with the onslaught of AI. And of course, neoliberalism has been declining. We've seen the rise of right-wing populism. So obviously, Hegel couldn't take all of this into account. So what is left from the philosophy of right, and what can we learn from it? How can we use it in our day and age?
Yeah, great to be here and really looking forward to this experience. And I know you did the exegetical reading spaces in the Lacanzi Cree course, and I'm super excited to see how that develops for the philosophy of right course. Of course, this is sort of perhaps why the Zizkian version of Hegel has reached such a popular appeal. Getting at your question is because he has this weird line where he says it's not what we think about Hegel, but what Hegel thinks about us. And the idea here was not what they like just constantly doing sort of um academic analyses of the specific details of Hegel's text. What did Hegel think? I think the point and what I've tried to develop at Philosophy Portal is to bring Hegel to our day so that we can look at the present through Hegel's eyes, so to speak, so that we can look at the present as it, like basically asking the question, if Hegel were alive today, how would he be thinking about contemporary dynamics? So it's not about sort of, bringing the actual text of Hegel's own writings to the 21st century, but more about learning the method of Hegel's thinking. Of course, dialectical method and speculative logic, respectively, in the phenomenology of spirit, and the science of logic, and the utility of bringing that gaze specifically to our present moment. And, um, you know, I think the most important reason here is that Hegel was a philosopher that, in regards to the philosophy of right, Hegel was a philosopher that wasn't shying away from developing a political philosophy. And I think today there is a tendency or a gravitation towards philosophers where I don't think their philosophy necessarily holds up to a robust global political analysis. Or they shy away from the political domain entirely, which I also think is potentially problematic. So, and then a final point is that political science today has become very data driven, right? It's a lot of data and it's not much theory. So going back to Hegel and reading, and even like, for example, I know there's some psychologists who did their doctorate. We're in a situation in neoliberalism where there's a lot of psychologists who have done their doctorate, but were never introduced to the original texts of Freud. In the same way that there are many political scientists who have done their doctorate and have never been exposed to a text like the philosophy of right. So really, Philosophy Portal is about going back to these foundational texts to bring that gaze to how are we to make sense of industrialization process, neoliberalism, techno-capital, and so forth. So these are some of the questions that I hope will be inspired both in the course, in the exegetical readings, and then further on, as you mentioned, the conference, the anthology. So we develop ideas in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean it was the birthday of Immanuel Kant recently. And to celebrate, I was rereading Was ist Aufklärung, what is enlightenment? And it's a great text. I would really say that what Zizek says about Kant is right. If you think Kant is boring, read him. You'll find out it's not boring at all. It's really he's a great writer. Um, but there is in this text, Kant proposes this progressivist teleology that things are going to get more enlightened, things are going to get better. And if you're familiar with what is enlightenment, he says we must publicly think. So, as a scholar, this is what in Kant's words, as a scholar, you have the responsibility not to privately talk about the truth or privately think about the truth with your friends or with your colleagues in your department or in your home, but you have to have the courage to bring this out for the entire world to read. He literally says this. And yeah, I think this is fantastic. Now, Kant also makes the addition that, well, first of all, his definition of enlightenment is to to go away from the self-imposed immaturity or muteness of people. Unmündigkeit. So it's like an immaturity or a muteness. And he says that, there's all these figures, religious figures, also scientific figures, who lead the people and makes the people mute. Now, something else that's important for Kant in what is enlightenment is that he says that people should actually they should not just like lash out at whatever regime or authority there is, which is not rightful or righteous. Only the scholars should have the privilege to have this. And he says, why is this the case? Because that's my reading. In some sense, the scholar has the privilege to be useless. Like as a police officer, you can't just not assume your orders. You have to do it. And if everyone, like if Kant would say, what is enlightenment? Enlightenment is if you say, fuck it, fuck the rules and, just get your freedom. And that's not going to work. So Kant was like, the scholars have a privilege to stimulate the spiritual and civil freedom. Now, freedom is also central for Hegel in the philosophy of right. And whereas the phenomenology of spirit is the science of experience, and the science of logic is the science of the concept. Hegel says the philosophy of right is the science of the state, which is a very unpopular way actually to denote such a thing. But I do believe he's responding to Kant's, to how Kant puts the question of freedom central. So I know you've made some videos on your own channel, and also on the website you can see the idea of social freedom coming up. So what is your idea of freedom or Hegel's idea of freedom, and why is it so important today?
Yeah, this is great. There's so many lines of thinking here that you're bringing up that I'd love to respond to, but like just get specifically to your question to start off. Like there's a scientist, his name's Robert Sapolsky, who just released a very popular book called Determined. The book is just simply titled Determined. And so anyone who wants to look that up, look up Determined, Robert Sapolsky, where he's basically arguing we don't have free will. And this is in the line of thinking that follows from Sam Harris's questioning of free will, the new atheist questioning of free will. There is this tendency today for the question of free will to become reduced to a non-dialectical form of determinism. And this reduction to a non-dialectical form of determinism seems to be inspired by mostly like a reductionist materialist science, in the sense that Robert Sapolsky spent his entire career, for example, studying baboons and then, and neuroscience, a baboon, and then translates this, presumably well thought out materialist science and just applies it to the human domain. Like, oh, it just naturally translates, right? Like, without like, and here, like, here's the sloppiness of it is, like, whereas, and I don't want to throw Sapolsky under the bus because I actually like him, but like, he spends his career studying baboons and then, oh, jumps to the question of free will. Oh, we're determined. Whereas Hegel is offering a much different philosophical experience, like, because he starts, as you say, with the science of experience. He starts with the phenomenology of spirit. He's not starting with baboons. He's starting with the science of experience, human experience, like, so he's really taken the time to understand human experience. And then he goes, like you said, to science of the concept, science of logic, so that he's thinking experience, he's thinking concept. And then he tries to develop a theory of the state. And what's really important is that the stakes for the concept of freedom versus determinism are actually of a socio-political, socio-historical nature. They're not reducible to, let's say, evolutionary history. The question of freedom is the question that emerges in human history, right? And the question of freedom emerges in human history with not just scientific dimensions and connotations, but I would also say the theological connotations, as Hegel also makes clear in the philosophy of right. So the point is here why I think it's important to study what Hegel's trying to get at with freedom and the philosophy of right is that this meditation is the result of Hegel's long standing interest in experience, in conceptualization, and the way that might translate to the socio-political domain. And what's crucial is that he analyzes, as you were mentioning, Kant and what is enlightenment, and it's super clear that Hegel's entire philosophical mission is in some sense a long, prolonged response to Kant. And that theme continues throughout the philosophy of right explicitly. But as you state, Kant in What is Enlightenment is basically moving philosophy, I think, into a developmental terrain. It's asking us to think about our own immaturity, not only as individuals, but also as a species. So we're coming out, like, I think from Kant's point of view, where enlightenment is coming out a type of species level immaturity. And of course, like in What is Enlightened, he says to use your own understanding, right? He even starts to use your own understanding. He says, well, even women should use their own understanding, like he says on the first few pages. And it's worth bringing that out because there are many people today who would like to take us back to a state of immaturity where either sexual difference is too problematic. We need to put that back in the bottle. Of course, that can't be put back in the bottle, so we have to think it through. So these dimensions are the dimensions I think that Hegel's wrestling with as a result of Kant's philosophy. And Hegel's taking the developmental standpoint and he's I think taking it to its logical conclusion. So, I think that's something which we don't see both in the sort of scientific materialist reductionist end of the spectrum, but we also don't see it in a sort of political science, which is too concerned with data and not enough concerned with fundamental theory. So I would throw that back at you there.
Yeah, right. And for Kant, we could read Kant as the man underlaying or underpinning Newtonian physics with his metaphysics. And Kant was actually, to put it in hyperbolic terms, terrified by his own project in the Critique of Pure Reason. Of course, he says that he wants to sublate knowing, to leave space open for believing, because for him the question of freedom and God were quintessential. And the stakes for Kant in What is Enlightenment, he ends this with a passage saying that it's only with freedom that we are more than machines. That's how we can know that we are more than machines, because we are free beings. And yeah, let's see where we, because perhaps it would be good to
This is
go.
fundamental, though. I want to
Yeah, sure,
emphasize for the
sure.
listeners, this is so fundamental what you're bringing out is that to understand Hegel's whole project, I think we have to situate it not only within the Kantian response, but that Kant himself was responding to Newton.
Yeah,
And I think this all together, like when you understand this as a totality, Newton, Kant, and Hegel all together, I think, and I throw this back to you, that we're moving from like an externalized space-time, absolute space-time as a background, to absolute freedom. Like it's kind of this inversion, and then what we thought was concrete in absolute space-time turns out to be abstract, and what most scientists take to be abstract, namely freedom, like that I was saying with the determinism, it actually turns out to be the opposite. That
yeah,
freedom is concrete, and space-time is abstract. Whereas in the Newtonian point of view, space-time is concrete and freedom is abstract. So I think that's like really the whole move.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes tons of sense. We could also read it in a way that the death of God leads to this absolutization of nature, of physics, of the cosmos, of matter, and then this in turn is leads us to the question of spirit and the question of, yeah, of spirit's actuality. And this is what Hegel goes into to a large extent in the preface. And there's yesterday I saw some hate speech law being erected in some country, and I thought that's so interesting because it that already implies freedom, and these hate speech laws are very icky because what is hate? What is hate according to the state? What would the state say to me if I ask the policymakers, okay, but please explain what is hate to me? These are not. Of course, they would say, "Yeah, that's the psychological domain. Just ask those neurologists or something," and they tell us then about the baboons lashing out. But one of the interesting oppositions that Hegel starts working with in the preface is the difference between uh, my subjective feeling towards something and unsatisfaction, and then formal logic, and how both are actually inadequate. So, for example, there with Kant, there's this after Kant also a degradation of philosophy. Philosophy is actually contempted by lots of people. They don't recognize it as a serious discipline, so they feel they can just speak about it. Like exactly a physical scientist would talk about freedom and about ontological dimensions without having studied them, as if you could do physics without doing metaphysics. Unfortunately, we see this a lot around us. Um, so there's this relapse into formal logic, and then on the other hand, there's people who have a sentiment that this doesn't make sense, this formal logic, this kind of abstracting, and then go to the image, basically, to fantasy, to subjective feeling, to maybe even like a resentment with the state of things, with how what the world that is right now. And for Hegel, these are both not enough. These are not these are not adequate starting points to think the state and to think politics. Now he also has a funny analogy about cabbage. I love that one. He's saying that like tons of people are basically content with reheating old cabbages. And it's basically pretending that you have a new idea, but you don't know that your idea is actually very old, which you come to know if you study history or the history of philosophy in some rigorous way. So we have all these kinds of things, and we can see it around us, right? We can see people who, when war erupts in Ukraine or Israel, Palestine, just start posting about being angry about it. And also, I mean, that shows us that behind the aggression, there's of course an impotence, like I cannot do anything about it, but it is happening, and it's so obviously horrible what's happening. Then on the other hand, there's the system builders who want to think the world with their formal logic, or who reduce questions of freedom to matter, to reductive biologies. And then we get also people who start thinking about, okay, these are not adequate, so we have to think about new ideologies. We have to make something new. What comes after postmodernism? We have to not deconstruct, but construct something. And then there's a plethora of different tastes of the pie. That's also not the way Hegel wants to go about it. So what is the way Hegel wants to go about it in this ecology of different spiritual stances, you could say?
Yeah, it's a mega difficult question and a super important question. So I like the way you're framing it. In regards to, let's say, on the one hand, the emotional reactivity to global geopolitical tensions or political frustrations, of course, like you say, fundamentally coming out of impotence. I think on the one hand, Hegel's saying that we cannot have a philosophy of politics which is driven by affects. We cannot have a philosophy of politics which is driven by the heart. We cannot have a philosophy of politics which is driven by, which I think is Hegel's main enemy throughout his entire philosophy, is kind of the intuition, which is not to say that the intuition is, or feeling, or subjective affect is inherently wrong or bad, or we shouldn't, as it were, listen to our intuitions or listen to our feelings, but just that they need to be mediated. I think it's just that, like, yes, there is a space for feeling and intuition and being angry and being upset. But those feelings and affects and intuitions, and I think a lot of that drives a lot of, let's say, groupthink and moral grandstanding. Like, I'm above you because I'm feeling really upset about this, and you're not feeling really upset about this, apparently. Right? Like that. But basically, what Hegel's saying to this sort of tendency is that this needs to be conceptually mediated. So we do need spaces to work with these affects and think through these affects to bring them to their conceptual truth. Like, what is the conceptual result of these affects? And I think that that's where we have the culture wars, because we don't have really the, let's say, robust, I don't know, mature, anti-fragile philosophical spaces where we can really think through these affects. We have a culture war. And in some sense, I would say Philosophy Portal is trying to provide a space for conceptual mediation of these affects in part. But we need more. We need more. We need it. We need it to become a cultural norm. We need it to become something that is a sign of an enlightened culture in a Kantian sense, right? And a form of intellectual, like you were pointing towards, inspired by Kant, that is really willing to think through everything that's at stake in contemporary politics, inclusive of the rage and the anger and the impotence, but to bring it to a conceptual level. And I think on the other side, what you were talking about people who want to construct something that comes after postmodernism, a new concept, right, that comes after postmodernism. This would be, I think, what Hegel would say is wanting to propose a new authority or wanting to propose a new law, which is in some sense a premature shot out of the pistol. Like, it's a premature law, it's a premature authority. It's just proposing a new concept and just, as it were, throwing it on the whole body without really having it be the result of a philosophical mediation. And I think the difference between just proposing a law or just proposing authority as a new sort of concept for our world is that it's not willing to, well, it's not capable of realizing that a new law or a new authority will only be retroactive. It will only be after the fact. It's basically not willing to be truly philosophical. in the sense of following the truth of what is to its result, and the law, the authority, the ideal will come after, but it won't be a result of your bright ideas, as it were. So I just want to, before throwing it back to you, I just want to summarize that throughout the start of the philosophy of right, we definitely get Hegel's idea of a philosophy of politics, which is on the one hand trying to avoid too much emphasis on the feeling and affects, which I think he thinks is a danger of Kantian philosophy. And then on the other hand, a too premature establishment of a new law or a new authority. And the reason why he wants to avoid both of those things is, I think, related to Kant's philosophy of enlightenment and mature thinking, which is that he says rational spirit is not satisfied with a theory of the state which either relies on intuitions, heart, or on authority or law, but it has to be reasoned out philosophically. So I think that's ultimately what Hegel's striving for there.
Yeah, I think that's very good. And I think here in the preface, he's not mentioning his name, but he's very explicitly talking about Kant when he mentions that there's a type of thinking which deems to find its freedom and the ground of its, let's say, ethical life um, in its thinking, in its withdrawal from from actually the world. And Hegel says that this right to withdraw is very high, and it's even godly for Hegel, but that it will turn into an unrighteousness when only this type of thinking is deemed as free. Why? Because it's it it deviates from the universal, from the universally recognized or the universally acknowledged, and from what counts, or from what um yeah, from what counts, and it finds itself in its own particularity, and it's, let's say, satisfied with knowing itself in its own particularity. Now, the wordplay in German here is that particularity, the word he uses here is besonderes, and also when something is besonder, you could say that it's special. Like, oh my God, you are so besonderes means you are so special. So you find your own specialness in the own freedom of your thought, away from the unrighteousness or the injustice of the outer world. But thereby you do something, which is that you deviate from what is universally recognized and what counts. And what for Hegel actually counts, which you already kind of pointed at, is what he calls Sittlichkeit, or I don't know what English word you want to use, but ethical life, I think, is a good one. And Sittlichkeit is a special kind of word. It's based on Sitte, and Sitte is a norm that's being passed down from traditions. And here immediately the dimension of psychoanalysis opens up for me, because it's not about what you say, it's what it is what's being said. It's not about what you mean. It's about your little slips. It's not about, how you. It's not about your ego veneer. It's about the way in which your ego veneer deceives. So there's this is the dimension of Sittlichkeit, or ethical life for me. And this we can only establish retroactively, because the drive is unconscious and desire is unconscious. We act it out. We don't know that we are acting out, but we are doing it anyway. This is also for Zizek how ideology functions. We can see in this way also that Zizek is utterly Hegelian in this way, in a politically a Hegelian way, because it's all about Sittlichkeit, or ethical life as unconscious in the present. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is super interesting. So from my reading of the preface and the introduction, Hegel seems to be taking some shots here at Hinduism and Brahman. Not sure if you picked up on the same thing, but he calls it a type of fanatical contemplation, which is that everything's sucked up into sort of just the contemplative thinking one, without the will, or what would be connected for Hegel in thinking through the will, which is ethical life. But just this, he also sort of takes a shot at Hinduism, I think, in the science of logic along the same lines, in regards to basically this separation between thought and will. That what he's really concerned about with the political philosophy is the unity of thought and will, where he says that on the one hand, thought without will is, again, this type of fanatical contemplation, self-contemplation, which, as you sort of emphasize, withdraws into itself, and only finds its own particularity, and removes itself from confronting what really counts, the universality of ethical life. On the other hand, he also says there's also a problem with will without thought. So on the one hand, we have the problem of thought without will, but on the other hand, we have the problem of will without thought. It's kind of like, we could say, like thinking and action. Like you can have thought without action and action without thought. And for Hegel, the example of action without thought or will without thought, he gives the example of the French Revolution, which is, he says, just demolishing organization, right? Which perhaps has a historical necessity in its moment, but is certainly not the end moment of the dialectical process. So he's trying to get at this unity of thought and will, which seems to me to point towards the construction of the state. In other words, the unity of thought and will is what brings out this so-called enlightened pose, which withdraws into itself to confront the real of ethical life, so that thinking and action are aligned in a philosophical manner. But of course, huge challenges here. That's the hardest thing to do, is to actually build on the level of human experience as a whole, on the level of historical conceptuality as a whole, a political state. Right? What's more difficult than that? Right? Like, and in some sense, the challenge in the philosophy of right, and Hegel's challenge for us, is to think that today, because the problems he's bringing up are not detached from things that we can observe in our contemporary socio-political reality. I would take the thought without will to be the tendency towards, let's say, Buddhist spiritual contemplation, spiritual withdrawal, or even Christian monasticism, a type of monkish life. Here I'm getting, I read recently the Desert Fathers, the 4th century Desert Fathers, Christian Desert Fathers books, where they just go into the desert and they withdraw into a monkish contemplation with God. This is a type of fanatical self-contemplation. So there's, on the one hand, that tendency, and then the demolishing all organizations angle, the will without thought angle. Well, we see that as well, because I think a lot of what the contemporary, whether it's alt-right or whether it's progressive woke, a lot of them are just trying to demolish. A lot of them are just trying to bring down. There's not really a movement which is constructive, and constructive in this Hegelian or philosophical sense of not wanting to jump the gun or not wanting to shoot prematurely, in the sense of, like, they're really willing to follow experience and follow the concept to its end result, and then retroactively we'll see what the truth of our concept is, or what the truth of our political action is.
Yeah, this is in one of the pages in the preface, he equates the concept of the true with the law of ethical life. So there's there's an interesting relationship here. There's always in Hegel an interesting relationship between the metaphysics and then how it's spiritually expressed. Another way we can go about this distinction that you came with acting and thinking, that Hegel explicitly mentions, is that there's mindless hearts, but then there's also heartless minds, which is obviously very tragic. And we can see the project of Hegel's especially Hegel's German idealism, but also Schelling and Fichte were attempting this in some way. And Goethe is an exemplary case of this too, is to bring these faculties together, to bring the understanding or reason together with feeling and intuition, and to harmonize oneself in this way. You know, when you listen to someone, the other day I was listening to a podcast with him, Tom McGowan will emphasize something like, for Hegel, there is no such thing as harmony. And I understand what he says with it. It's not that Hegel doesn't believe in this dream that there's no tension, or there's like or that the interruptions or disruptions will leave us. Like, negativity is here to stay and is here to work with. But what I believe Hegel means with harmony is the example he gives of music being harmonious, not despite contradiction, but because of contradiction. Because the different tones contrast each other and might even be dissonant with each other, you know, atonal music, for example, that's where actually harmony comes from. And I think this is a different way to go about the human subject as a creature of drive and of desire, as psychoanalysis gets it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves too much. Something else which Hegel talks about is that this type of immediate feeling against the state, or this type of thought that immediately wants to renew the state. Let's just get another kind of state. It doesn't acknowledge that the state as it exists, the concreteness of it, the ethical life, which is the way we act and the way we think, has been a result of a labor that's been going on for thousands of years. Thousands of years, you know. So what do you think about this?
Well, it's a weird thing. I'm glad you brought this up. I think it's a super important point at the beginning of the philosophy of right, which is, you know, it's here's the weird thing, and I think this is what makes Hegel special as a philosoph, like in his project of the philosophical sciences, which I take to be, you know, his main project, is that for some reason in what we consider normative science, when we see something that has existed for thousands of years, or when we see something that has existed for millions of years, we take a delight and an interest in it, right? Like, think about scientists that dedicate their life to evolutionary biology. Well, why are they taking a delight in evolutionary biology? Because it's been there for millions of years. It's worth our study. It's a truth which is worth our study and contemplation. Same thing for cosmology. When cosmologists study the universe, they study it and take delight because it's been there for billions of years. But for some reason, when it comes to human social organization, we do not take delight in studying something which has been concretely existing for thousands of years. Right? So I think what Hegel's saying is that when we assume that the state as a concrete social historical project has been around for thousands of years, what he's asking us to do is don't just create out of nothing. Don't just pretend that you can create your own ideal state out of nothing. Don't just think that don't just think that the idea that's just popped into your head when you're 19 years old or when you're 20 years old about the way the world should be, right? Because that's the tendency. That's the tendency of a young man.
I just want to affirm, like, the way the world should be. So it's not an interest with how it is and a deep study of that. It's like this inclination, it has to change. It should be according to my subjective feeling and inclination. Yeah.
That's it. So that's really what Hegel's trying to be an antidote to, which is the temptation of my mind as a young man, or not even as a young man, my heart in its intuition says the world should be some utopian, something way better than it is. Something way better than it is. And here, I've always had that feeling. right? That like that feeling's persistent. Like I think the world should be better than it is, and in some sense, what Hegel's saying is no. Well, philosophy is about, in some sense, tarrying with that affect, but bringing yourself to the cognitive capacity to think with what actually is towards a world that could be better, but you don't know how. You don't know how it could be better, right? And in some sense, what Hegel's pleading is that, and I'm going to pull out a direct quote here, but what Hegel's pleading is that the world can be much better than it is, but only if we're willing to think with what actually is in its negativity. And if we're willing to stay with what actually is in its negativity in the direction of trying to build something better than it is, the world might surprise us. The world might turn out to provide us with an ideal after the fact, which is actually better than what we thought would be a good ideal. So let me bring out the specific quote, which I'd love to see what you think about it in relationship to what you're saying about harmony and tension that you were quoting with McGowan. So this is from page 20 of my version of the Philosophy of Right. It's just a short quote. Quote, only one word more concerning the desire to teach the world what it ought to be. For such a purpose, philosophy at least always comes too late. So he's saying, when it comes to the distinction between ought and is, philosophy here is kind of castrated on the level of ought. He says, philosophy as the thought of the world does not appear until reality has completed its formative process and made itself ready. So we can think about that in regards to Kant's developmental philosophy. It's almost like Kant is appearing at the end of some formative process to give it its sort of philosophical reflection in some sense. And then here's the final quote. History thus corroborates the teaching of the conception that only in the maturity of reality does the ideal appear as a counterpart to the real, apprehends the real world in its substance, and shapes it into an intellectual kingdom, end quote. And then we get the Owl of Minerva and stuff like this. But the point is that the ideal only comes after the fact. So he's an idealist in a sense, but do you see, I think, the importance of why Zizek emphasizes dialectical materialism? I think the emphasis on dialectical materialism is because we have to stay with thinking the material real in its negativity, in its brutal unideality, and only then might the ideal appear, as it were, as a counterpart to the real after the fact. And I think that logic, I think that same logic is at work in Hegel's phenomenology with absolute knowing. I think that same logic is at work in the science of logic with the absolute idea. And I think that logic is at work in the philosophy of right with absolute freedom. So somehow, and I think this is the meta Hegelian project, which maybe someone like you will be able to develop, is how can we think? It's interesting the way Hegel ends every work. Phenomenology of spirit ends with what? Absolute knowing. Science of logic ends with what? Absolute idea. Philosophy of right ends with what? Absolute freedom. So what's the link here? Knowing, idea, freedom, experience, concept, politics. This has, I feel like there's something we need to. This is how we go beyond Hegel, by like becoming more by seeing in Hegel's project, which by definition he could never have seen while writing it himself.
Yeah, I see the meta-Hegelian thing you're doing, where it's the retroactivity of Hegel's own owl of Minerva. It will not be able, like, it's not Hegel who could actually write his own owl down to put his own gray in that sense. Yeah, yeah, that's I have some thoughts about this actually, because if you take a look at his entire system, the triadic modes of the three modes of God for Hegel are logic or metaphysics, and then nature, and then spirit. And the very end of the philosophy of spirit, which thank God he actually developed, he ends with this big block of an Aristotle quote. about God thinking his own thoughts and thinking of its own thoughts, and it's like this. Uh, it's kind of messy, this very like highly philosophical thing, using the word thinking like loads of times in that quote. But I think what it gets at is the spiritual thinking drive. I think this is what Hegel is getting at, because obviously for Hegel, absolute spirit uh, has its highest, well, yeah, the truest form of absolute spirit, or of spirit, is absolute spirit, which is philosophy. So not religion, not art, but this like thinking drive. And yeah, that's that's very rich, something to think. Um, yeah, so more
I
about,
think we should double. I just very quickly say I
yeah,
want to double down for the listeners, for people who are really interested in this stuff, is that the consequence of what you're saying is that with the spiritual thinking drive being sort of the pinnacle of all of this, is that in order to be a philosopher, all you need to do is really be committed to thinking what is in its negativity, and
yeah.
to work with that. That in itself is the philosophical gesture. So paradoxically, if you're committed to doing that, then technically you don't need to read all the history of philosophy, whatever, to be a philosopher. And paradoxically, if you're really, although I think it does help, but if you're really committed to doing that, then paradoxically, again, you kind of become more philosophical than someone who's an academic philosopher who's not committed to doing that, right? Because you can be an academic philosopher and not really committed to that thinking drive and its negativity.
Yeah, totally. And I think the stakes of my disagreement with Tom McGowan are huge here, actually, because it's a question of, are we allowed to say harmony is, or are we to say harmony is not? Because I mean, when I say the word harmony, it's harmony sounds nice, right? When we listen to music, it's harmonious. That's nice to us. It's gratifying, satisfying. Um, yeah, we get this liberating feeling when we listen to a beautiful piece of music. That's what its harmony does to us. So do we have to say, well, because harmony also could be understood in this naive way, that we have to say, okay, we're not going to use this word and we're going to say contradiction is fundamental? Or are we to go with the way Hegel goes about this, which is, even if my philosophy, or yeah, my philosophy of science, or like my philosophical science of experience, concept, and state, even if that's going to be in disrepute, it's not going to be appreciated, because the huge part of the preface, he goes into how philosophy is actually kind of died down. People are contempting it. They don't take it seriously. They feel like they can say whatever about it. But he's like, no, I'm gonna absolutize myself. And this is the stakes of this are also huge, because to go post Kant, we have to stay with the Kantian. We have to stay cognizant of the Kantian move to go from the outer substance to the I. And for Hegel, the concept is the I, and the I is the concept, which we could also rephrase as the spiritual thinking drive itself, in a way. So if the I is the concept and the concept is the I, and the concept is a mode of, like, the logical idea is a mode of God, then I am God, literally. And this is the megalomania of philosophy too. Now, I was recently actually
It's
discussing,
yeah.
just to finish, I was recently discussing this exact topic, the megalomania of philosophy, with someone, Hegelian actually, and she told me, well, no, but Hegel is so humble. And I completely agree with that. But I do think that it's on the one hand one-sided to say Hegel is humble, and also one-sided to say Hegel is this megalomaniac who is, he is, for the last 200 years, he's a lot of times being thought as this panlogicist. That's not the way to go. But also, it's not the way to go to say there's just a humility there. No, absolute spirit, absolute knowing, absolute freedom. What are you talking about, man? Like, the I is the concept, which is God. And I think the very the very fact that Hegel allows himself to do this also attests to the greatness of his project, which probably if you even click this video, you do appreciate.
There's something mega important here. I'm not going to be able to probably get at sort of the mega importance of what you're trying to express here with Hegel's humbleness, but there is a way in which, in attempting to theorize the absolute in the way he's doing it, there is something that's more humble in Hegel's work than, let's say, the type of grand systematization and grand theorizing that I do see going on in whether it's the sciences or elsewhere. There is something humble in Hegel's gesture, which I don't see in a lot of other grand theorizing, and well, that's an interesting topic. But I just want to sort of bring sort of extra attention to what you're framing here as the problem of how do we think harmony in Hegel. And I think he gives us the resources to answer this question in the philosophy of right, specifically in the passages that you and I have discussed previously about the rose and the cross of the present. Like when we think about the rose and the cross of the present, like the word Hegel uses explicitly is reconciliation with reality. But this isn't reconciliation. I think what we want to avoid, and maybe this is what McGowan's pointing towards, is what we want to avoid is a notion of reconciliation or a notion of harmony, which is a type of very naive oneness where all distinctions or all significant differences are erased or eliminated. I think that what's true to Hegel's philosophy is reconciliation with reality is, and the rose in the cross of the present is that it's inclusive of radical differences. It's inclusive of radical discord. And I think that there's something deeply true about this. When I study my own thinking drive, there are fantastic things that have emerged, but there's also been tremendous discord. And there has to be some faith. I don't know if faith is the right word, or there has to be some reconciliation that the process of the thinking drive itself is good if I just stay with it. Like that I can trust this. I can trust this. Discord will happen. Major differences will appear. People will oppose you. People will try to undermine you. People might even betray you. But there's something about the rose and the cross of the present in terms of mediating the immediacy of your present moment rationally. I think there's something humble about that. That's where there's something humble. That to be willing to stay with that. What's not humble is to propose some grand system or grand vision or some grand idea, which would somehow lift you above that or take you away from that. And I think that's the misinterpretation of Hegel. Hegel's not outside of that. He's actually quite humble. And so
Yeah.
when I read Marx on Hegel, I almost feel like he's guilty. Marx is guilty a little bit of trying, and Kierkegaard, like they're a little bit guilty of claiming that Hegel is trying to lift himself above that. Like, and maybe that's because I know Kierkegaard might have learned Hegel through Schelling or something like that. I don't know. And this is my question. I'll throw it back to you. I'm not sure how well the main detractors of Hegel in Hegel's time, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and so on, I'm not sure how well they actually studied Hegel. Like, I bet we've studied Hegel deeper than they studied Hegel. No?
Well,
Maybe that's too
I
far,
don't,
but maybe
I
we can't say, but
yeah.
that's my suspicion.
Yeah, well, it's funny because in the preface he literally says that there is this kind of type um of inclination of a stance that deems the actuality of the state to be nullity. And it's funny because this German word like eitel, it could be like nullity, but it also could be like pride. So it looks in the world and it sees the fakeness of politicians and things like this, and the fakeness of capitalists. Um, but what it does in return is that it raises itself above this reality, and because it sees this reality as null, and like has its own idea about what it has to enforce, it becomes itself null, because at the end of the day, this reality is dot. Yeah, that's it. And
There
like,
was just very quickly,
yeah,
there was this conference where it was a spiritual conference, and there was a woman who was asking a spiritual guru, not well, more telling the spiritual guru that she's organizing a political conference, global political conference, and she's not inviting politicians because they're all corrupt. So it's a global political conference, no politicians invited. But this is exactly the type of spiritual consciousness which is avoiding the real of politics. Like, if you actually get involved in politics, the best is the documentary on Arnold Schwarzenegger, who, when he became governor of California. I think in that documentary, you get a true insight into the real of politics. He just says, if you're in politics, what it is, it's just endless problems and mistakes with no final resolution. That's just what it is. So that's what that like the politics of the state is nothing but the capacity to construct some sort of organization which is capable of enduring endless, unpredictable failures and mistakes and mess. And it's never going to be ideal in that sense.
yeah, totally. And this, we could make a little funny metaphor here, and that it's like it's going to a relationship therapist with your toxic boyfriend, but not inviting the toxic boyfriend along. And for this is the way I read the what is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational, which is Sittlichkeit, or ethical life, which is the mess of your relationship, actually. Not only with your direct loved one, but also politically. Like, these types of things, they mirror each other. And this is so eventually he comes with this idea, well, I'm going to give you a rose so you can dance. You can dance in the present. And it's not it's I mean, if you actually dance with a dancing partner, you can make mistakes, especially if you start out. Like, you're gonna make mistakes all the time, but there's still, you can sublate it within the harmony of the dance. You can do this, but you have to stay aware of the other, because if your dancing is not like an und für sich, if it's not a dancing that's like tarrying with the objectivity of the other's movement, and you just go by your own subjective feeling, well, then there's no dance. There's no place
Is
for
your
dance.
system capable of dancing? And I think where the lack of humbleness comes, I think the lack of humbleness is someone who proposes a big system, but his system cannot dance with the concreteness of life.
Yeah, I think it sacrifices the concreteness of life for its own subjective feeling. Yeah. Does that
Yeah,
make
yeah,
sense?
yeah,
That's how
exactly.
I. And this it's
No, that's
yeah.
I think that's exactly precise.
There's also I mean, there's so much more we could go into, but this is the reason why the course is going to be so exciting.
Let's do a second episode on my channel where we extend it.
Sure, sure. And yeah, so thanks a lot for coming. Again, the course starts May 18th. It's going to go through June. I'm going to do the exegetical readings. The last 4 months I've been studying German like a madman, so now I can actually read Hegel in German without a problem. Well, of course, I do still have problems with the theory, or like difficulties, but I can read it. And yeah, Cadell's gonna host the lectures and the workshops. There's gonna be a conference and an anthology, and I think this book is so pertinent for our day and age. So if you have any final words.
Yeah, I just think that this is where philosophy meets politics. And I think that we can study a lot of philosophies that approach spiritual dimensions, higher consciousness, um, process, thinking about the whole. which don't include politics on a deep level, like really getting into the nitty-gritty of like political theory. And I think that as a result of that, we do have a tendency within, let's say, the higher thinking web spaces of this temptation to regress to something that looks like it's pre-modern, politically pre-modern in various forms. It can go in many directions. But I think the stakes of really staying with the philosophy of right, and hopefully what will come out of the course, is the capacity that we can raise our concept to what you mentioned throughout our talk, the universality of ethical life, and not regress to our particularity. I think that's really what I would like to avoid in these liminal web or underground theory spaces. Let's not regress to particularity. Let's move our particularity to universality. Let's wager that what we're doing does have let's wager that what we're doing does have a universal value if we're willing to really think through and continue this philosophy to its logical conclusion, because the stakes are high. I think politics today does need to be rethought, and here the wager at Philosophy Portal is that Hegel's work can help. So if you're interested, philosophyportal.online. I'll be teaching. Dimitri will be doing exegetical readings.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
The next Philosophy Portal course focuses on Hegel's philosophy of right, a text which represents Hegel's most mature political notion of rights. The course starts May 18th, 2024. To find out more, visit philosophyportal.online. Hegel's philosophy of right approaches a science exploring the political tension between will and world, as well as their collision into family, community, state, and world spirit. The course runs through May and June, with the first class starting May 18th. There will be 5 lectures and discussions hosted by myself, Cadell Last, as well as 2 exegetical reading spaces with philosopher Dimitri Croimans. You will get access to these courses for a lifetime, as well as an invitation to participate in a student-led conference and the opportunity to submit your own publication for a student-led anthology process. To learn the foundation of Hegel's mature political notion this May and June, sign up now at philosophyportal.online, and I hope to see you on the other side.